A spoiled
What do
rich
you think
boy
you're
thought he
doing?
could kick a
Leave that
starving
little
German
girl
Shepherd
alone right
puppy
now.
and terrorize a tiny 5-year-old girl on a quiet,
Hey,
wealthy
what do you
street,
think you're doing?
simply because no one ever told him no. He laughed as Emily cried, believing his money and his father's name made him untouchable. But he made one fatal mistake, because watching from a distance was a battle-hardened Navy SEAL and his retired K-9 partner, two warriors who don't stand by while the innocent suffer. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from.
Everything is
And
going
if
to
this
be
story
fine
touches
now.
your heart, please subscribe for
safe.
more. A humid, late-afternoon haze clung to the upscale neighborhood like a quiet, shimmering veil. Emily Carter, a 5-year-old girl with a thin frame, tangled chestnut hair, and soft brown eyes too sad for her age, dragged a squeaky wire cart overloaded with cans and plastic bottles along the immaculate sidewalk. Her clothes were simple. An oversized pink t-shirt faded from too many washings and a pair of shorts far too big for her, but she moved with a shy determination. Ever since her parents died 2 years earlier in a highway accident, Emily had lived with her grandmother, helping however she could. The grief had aged her small heart, giving her a gentleness that made her look as if she always expected the world to hurt, but still chose kindness anyway. Despite carrying a childhood shaped by loss, she tried every day to lighten her grandmother's burden, whispering to herself that even children could be strong if they needed to be. The rich neighborhood was foreign to her, a place of high hedges trimmed to perfection, polished cars that shone like jewels, and people who never looked down at the sidewalk long enough to notice a child pushing a rattling cart. Emily always felt invisible here, but she preferred that to being stared at. As she passed a row of glass storefronts, she hummed softly, trying to ignore the ache in her small arms. Then a harsh sound cracked across the street, a sharp yelp, thin and frightened. Emily froze. A second cry followed, and her heart clenched in instinctive fear. She pushed her cart aside and stepped towards the noise, peering around a parked luxury SUV. That was when she saw him. A tiny German Shepherd puppy, no older than 3 or 4 months, crouched on the asphalt, ribs visibly outlined under muddy fur. His ears, too floppy to stand, twitched in panic, and his tail was tucked tightly beneath him. His body trembled violently as he tried to crawl backward, but his paws slipped repeatedly on the smooth pavement. His eyes, large, dark, desperate, looked like 2 terrified marbles pleading for help. Standing over him was Brandon Hale, a teenager around 17 with slick blonde hair, an expensive white shirt half untucked, and a face molded by wealth and entitlement. His athletic frame and designer sneakers contrasted sharply with his drunken sway. Brandon was handsome in the kind of careless way that came from never hearing no, but his expression was twisted with sour anger. In one hand, he held a half-empty bottle of imported beer. In the other, he tightened his grip on a car key fob like it was a weapon. The alcohol on his breath fueled a cruelty already rooted in a life where consequences never seemed to reach him. Beside him were 2 friends, tall, skinny boys dressed in matching polos and smug grins, but they hung back, laughing nervously, uncomfortable yet too cowardly to intervene. Emily's breath hitched when Brandon kicked the puppy again, this time hard enough for the little body to roll onto its side. The puppy whimpered, a sound so small it fractured something inside her. Without thinking, she hurried forward, tears burning her eyes even before she reached him. The world seemed to muffle, as though every sound faded except the desperate pounding of her own heart. She dropped to her knees and scooped the puppy into her arms. His tiny chest fluttered frantically beneath her hands, and she could feel every trembling bone. She pressed him close, shielding him with her small frame and whispering, "It's okay. I'm here. Don't be scared." Her voice cracked as tears streaked her dirty cheeks. She didn't know she was shaking until she felt his trembling matching hers. Brandon paused, stunned that a small, dirty girl had dared to step between him and his entertainment. His surprise twisted quickly into rage. His eyebrows dipped, and a smirk of cruelty curled on his lips. "What do you think you're doing?" he slurred, pointing his beer bottle at her like a threat. "Hey, trash girl, put down that mutt." Emily squeezed the puppy tighter. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Please stop, he didn't do anything." But her fear seeped through the words, trembling and raw. Brandon scoffed, taking a step closer. Up close, Emily could see the redness in his unfocused eyes, the faint stubble on his jaw, the twitchy impatience of someone used to getting whatever he wanted. "Don't touch what's not yours," he snarled. "Move!" Emily didn't move. Instead, she curled her body around the puppy, shielding him completely. Her heart thudded so hard she could taste fear in her mouth. She knew she wasn't strong. She knew she couldn't fight him. But something deeper than fear held her in place, an instinct as natural to her as breathing. No one should be alone in hurting, not even a little dog. Brandon's anger boiled over. His friends fell silent. The street seemed to forget its wealthy indifference for a moment and leaned into the tension. Brandon raised his foot, twisting his body back, preparing to kick both the child and the helpless puppy in one furious motion. Emily shut her eyes, tightening her grip around the shivering animal. Her tiny shoulders braced. She whispered to the puppy again, "I'm not letting go, I promise." And then Brandon's foot swung forward. The swing of Brandon's foot never reached Emily. A blur of motion cut across the street, swift and decisive, followed by a deep, commanding growl that didn't belong to any ordinary dog. Ranger, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat, muscular build, and a faint scar carved along his left flank, lunged forward and planted himself directly between the teenager's strike and the shaking child. Ranger's ears were rigid. His amber eyes locked onto Brandon with the cold precision of a trained protector. Despite his intimidating posture, every muscle in the dog vibrated with leashed control, the kind drilled into military canines who had spent years learning not to attack unless absolutely necessary. Behind Ranger came Daniel Walker. He was a man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a rugged face shaped by sun, sand, and too many years spent in hostile territories. His hair was cropped short, peppered with early gray, and his jaw carried the faint shadow of stubble that only made him look more severe. A thin scar cut across his right eyebrow, an old injury from years back during a mission he rarely spoke about, one that had taken several of his teammates and left him with a stubborn guilt he never entirely escaped. His dark blue eyes were sharp, always analyzing, always ready. The kind of eyes that had seen danger too many times to ever fully relax. Even in jeans and a worn gray t-shirt, Daniel carried the posture of a soldier who had never quite learned how to stop being one. He reacted before he even consciously processed the scene, his instincts faster than thought. When Brandon's leg swung forward again, Daniel moved in a flash. He intercepted the kick with one arm, gripping the boy's ankle tightly enough to make Brandon yelp. With a twist of his torso, he redirected the momentum, sending the teenager stumbling backward until he fell flat onto the sidewalk, beer bottle rolling out of his hand and clattering across the concrete. Brandon blinked in confusion, then outrage. His cheeks flushed bright red, and he scrambled to his feet, wobbling from both shock and booze. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he spat, voice cracking with anger and disbelief. Daniel took one step forward. That alone forced Brandon to swallow his next insult. The air around the QU seal felt heavier, as if the weight of 1,000 silent warnings clung to him. Ranger, standing tall beside him, lowered his head slightly, muscles coiling in case the boy tried to strike again. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Walk away," he said, calm but edged with steel. Now. Brandon puffed up his chest, but the tremble in his chin betrayed him. Still, he tried to regain his ego in front of his friends, two teenage boys who looked like carbon copies of him. Rich haircuts, expensive clothes, and the identical expression of someone who had never faced real consequences. One boy had freckles and a narrow frame. The other was lanky with nervous eyes that darted between Daniel and Ranger as if weighing the chances of survival. "You have no idea who my father is," Brandon hissed. "He owns half this district. You mess with me, you mess with him." Daniel didn't blink. Instead, he reached into his back pocket, revealing a worn leather wallet and flipping it open just enough to show his identification. United States Navy SEAL, retired after 14 years of service. The emblem alone made Brandon freeze. His friends stopped breathing entirely. "I don't care who your father is," Daniel said quietly. "You raise a foot against a child or an animal again, and you'll answer for it. Understand?" Brandon's jaw worked in silent fury, but fear won over pride. He scooped up his beer bottle, motioned angrily for his friends to follow, and the trio backed away toward their luxury car. Before climbing in, Brandon pointed a shaky finger at Emily, then at Daniel. "This isn't over," he muttered. "You'll regret sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." But the threat rang hollow against the background of Ranger's deep growl. The boy slammed the car door shut, and the vehicle peeled away, leaving the scent of burnt rubber in its wake. The street fell silent again. Emily remained crouched on the pavement, still clutching the trembling puppy to her chest. Her breaths came in tiny, uneven gasps. Tears streaked her cheeks, mixing with dust and fear. Daniel knelt beside her, his movements slow and careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Hey there," he said gently, voice much softer than the one he'd used moments earlier. "You're safe now. Is the puppy hurt?" Emily looked up at him, eyes muddied and watery. Up close, Daniel could see how fragile she was. Thin arms, scraped knees, and a small face that carried far too much sadness for 5 years of life. But beneath the fear, there was also bravery. She had thrown herself into danger without hesitation. That alone stirred something protective in Daniel's chest, something he hadn't felt in years. I think he's scared," Emily whispered. "He was crying, and I didn't want him to get hurt anymore." Daniel nodded. "You did something very brave." He extended one hand, palm open. "May I hold him for a moment? Just to check?" Emily hesitated, then slowly let Daniel examine the puppy. The little German shepherd whimpered softly but didn't struggle. Daniel ran his fingers gently along the pup's legs and ribs. "He's shaken, but nothing broken. He's a tough little guy." Ranger approached then, lowering his head to sniff the puppy. Emily startled at first, but Ranger's gentle posture, the way he nudged the pup softly with his nose, made her relax. The puppy whimpered again, but this time in a quieter, seeking way, as if realizing he was among protectors now. Daniel smiled faintly. "Looks like Ranger likes him. How about we give this little one a name?" He looked at Emily. "Any ideas?" Emily wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "Maybe. Buddy, because he needs a friend." Daniel nodded. "Buddy it is." Ranger's tail wagged once, deliberate and approving. Emily let out a small, shaky breath, still overwhelmed, still trembling. Daniel reached out and lightly squeezed her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. "We've got you." And for the first time that afternoon, Emily believed it. The sun had begun its slow descent, leaving the neighborhood brushed with a warm orange glow as Daniel walked beside Emily, Ranger pacing protectively on her other side, and the small puppy buddy tucked safely in her arms. The quiet street gradually shifted from polished sidewalks and manicured hedges to cracked pavement and aging brick walls. Each step took them farther away from the pristine world that had ignored Emily's tears, and closer to the worn-down part of town where survival looked different, and people carried their stories in their eyes. Emily led the way with small, cautious steps. She walked with the hesitance of a child who was used to navigating spaces where the world didn't quite feel safe. Daniel observed her carefully, noting the way she occasionally glanced up at him as if checking whether he was really still there, whether this strange moment of rescue hadn't simply evaporated like so many of her childhood hopes. Ranger stayed near her ankles, a steady shadow, his ears twitching toward every passing sound. The dog's focus was sharp, military sharp, but his eyes softened whenever he looked at the child. When they reached her home, Daniel paused to take in the sight. The building was a small, sagging structure wedged between two larger apartment complexes. Its faded blue paint peeled off in long strips, and the front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. A patch of tar paper on the roof fluttered weakly in the wind, barely holding off the threat of rain. Daniel's trained eye caught every structural flaw immediately. It wasn't just old, it was vulnerable, the kind of place that wouldn't withstand a hard storm, let alone a threat from someone like Brandon. Emily shifted nervously. "Sorry it's messy," she whispered, her voice small enough to crumble in the wind. Daniel shook his head gently. "Emily, you don't ever need to apologize for where you live." She blinked, surprised by how simply and confidently he said it. The front door creaked open, revealing Rose Carter, Emily's grandmother. Rose was in her late 60s, but poverty and worry made her look older. She was short and slender, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and deep lines etched around her kind gray eyes. Eyes that carried exhaustion but also love fierce enough to raise an orphaned child. She wore a faded floral dress and an old sweater with fraying cuffs. Her posture was slightly bent, the posture of someone whose back had carried too many burdens alone, yet she held herself with a stubborn dignity that Daniel instantly respected. "Emily?" Rose gasped, stepping outside with unexpected swiftness. "Where have you—" Her voice trailed off when she saw Daniel, Ranger, and the trembling puppy in Emily's arms. Her gaze sharpened, wary and protective. "Who is this man?" Emily quickly explained in a flood of words. How Buddy had been hurt, how Brandon had attacked, how Daniel and Ranger had saved her. Rose listened, silently, her jaw tightening at every detail of the cruelty inflicted on the small dog and her granddaughter. When Emily finished, Rose exhaled shakily. "Sir, thank you," she said, straightening her shoulders despite the tremble in her hands. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't owe me a thing," Daniel replied. His voice was gentle in a way most people never heard from men who had lived through war. "I just want to make sure you both are safe." Rose hesitated, the humility of a poor woman caught between gratitude and embarrassment. "We manage," she insisted softly. "We always manage." But Daniel had already noticed the loose latch on the door, the cracked window frame, the worn carpet visible through the doorway. The faint smell of dampness drifted from inside. Mold, likely. He saw how Rose stood partly leaning on the doorframe, as if it had become something of a crutch. "Do you mind if I take a look at your door?" Daniel asked. "It's hanging wrong. Easy fix." Rose flinched, unused to kindness. But Emily tugged her sleeve. "Grandma, he helped me, and Buddy." Rose's expression softened. "All right," she said, "just the door." Once inside, Ranger carefully trotted around, sniffing corners but moving with the discipline of a dog who understood boundaries. Buddy stayed pressed against Emily's chest, but for the first time his tail twitched slightly upward when Ranger approached, offering a slow nuzzle to reassure him. The home was small but clean. A single-room living area doubled as a kitchen, and a thin curtain separated Emily's sleeping space from Rose's. On the countertop sat a few cans of soup, a loaf of bread nearing its expiration, and a half-empty bottle of cough medicine. Daniel's chest tightened. He had seen families living like this all over the world, in remote villages, in war-torn towns, and yet somehow it hurt more when it was here, in the country he had sworn to protect. While Daniel examined the door's hinges, Ranger stationed himself near Rose, quietly lowering his head into her hand. She startled at first, but then smiled softly, stroking the dog's fur with thin, trembling fingers. "He's a soldier, too," Daniel said from across the room. "Retired now, but he still knows when someone needs him." Rose's eyes glistened. "He's very gentle. Only with the right people." Ranger's tail thumped once. Daniel worked swiftly, tightening screws, realigning the doorframe, stabilizing the hinge. His hands carried the surety of a man used to repairing things: locks, weapons, hearts held together by fractures. Emily watched with wide eyes, fascinated by how quietly he moved despite his size. Buddy, finally feeling secure, leaned into her side and let out a small sigh. Once the repairs were done, Daniel stood and wiped the dust from his palms. "There," he said. "At least now it'll close properly." Emily smiled for the first time since he had met her. It was small, hesitant, but real. The kind of smile that made Daniel feel something shift inside him, something he thought he had buried. That night, before Daniel left, he knelt to Emily's height. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said, "to check on Buddy and to see if you need anything." Emily nodded and hugged Buddy closer. "Thank you for helping us." Ranger stepped forward, brushing his nose gently against Emily's hand. The child giggled, a sound so bright it briefly washed away the shadows in the room. For the first time in a long time, the tiny house echoed with warmth. But far away, anger brewed in another household. And the peace the Carter family felt that night would soon be tested. Night settled over the cramped neighborhood like a heavy blanket, dimming the last embers of warmth that had flickered inside Rose's fragile home. The glow from the single porch light stretched weakly across the uneven concrete steps, illuminating a space that always seemed too quiet after sunset. Daniel had left only an hour earlier, promising to check on them in the morning, but the stillness that followed his departure made the air feel brittle with unease. Ranger had lingered outside the house for several minutes before obeying Daniel's quiet signal to follow. Yet even the memory of the dog's watchful eyes wasn't enough to calm the fear slowly returning to Emily's chest. It happened shortly after midnight. The sharp crash of metal hitting pavement ripped through the silence, jolting Emily awake. She sat straight up in her small bed, heart hammering, while Buddy, who had been curled tightly beside her, jumped with a startled yelp. A second crash echoed outside, followed by a mocking laugh. Emily scrambled off the bed, her tiny feet hitting the cold floor as she rushed toward the window, pulling aside the thin curtain. Out there, illuminated by the yellow street lamp, stood 3 young men. None were Brandon, but all bore the same arrogant carelessness of teenagers who believed themselves untouchable. The tallest one, a broad-shouldered boy with dark hair shaved short along the sides, kicked the remains of Emily's cart, a dented wire trolley she had spent months collecting cans with. He wore a black varsity jacket and scuffed sneakers, and his harsh laughter shook through the night. His name was Kyle Turner, a known follower of Brandon, with a reputation for picking fights behind the high school gym. He moved with the restless energy of someone who enjoyed inflicting fear, simply because it made him feel powerful. Beside Kyle was Mason Briggs, a lanky blond boy with acne scars across his jawline, and an uneasy smirk that revealed he wasn't as bold as the others. Mason came from a wealthy family, but was constantly overshadowed by more dominant personalities. He followed Brandon's crowd because it made him feel less invisible, even if it meant hurting others. The third boy, Liam Ferris, short and stocky, wore a red hoodie pulled over his head. His expression was dull, uninterested, as though he were simply there because someone had told him to be. Emily watched in horror as Kyle stomped down on the bent metal of her cart, flattening it completely. "Brandon says the trash girl needs a lesson," he laughed. "So, here's a lesson." Buddy whimpered in her arms. Emily's throat closed with helpless panic. She turned away from the window and ran to wake her grandmother. Rose sat up immediately, her hands trembling as she reached for her glasses. Though frail, with thinning silver hair and wrinkles etched deep by both age and grief, her eyes sharpened quickly with maternal fear. "Emily, stay away from the windows. Don't let them see you watching." "But my cart," Emily whispered, tears forming. "I know, sweetheart," Rose murmured, stroking her cheek. "We'll figure it out tomorrow. Right now, we stay safe." But safety felt like a fragile idea in that moment. The taunting voices faded after a final crash as the boys knocked over their garbage bin and disappeared into the darkness. Rose sat awake long after, listening for every sound outside. Sleep didn't come for her, not with fear gnawing at the edges of her strength. And when dawn finally began stretching pale beams across the cracked floorboards, her eyes had never once closed. As soon as morning broke, Daniel returned. He arrived earlier than promised, Ranger alert at his side, both sensing something wrong the moment they stepped onto the street. Ranger's ears perked forward, nostrils flaring. The dog emitted a low growl as if reading the fear still clinging to the air. When Emily opened the door, her face fell into a mixture of relief and dread. Daniel knelt to her level immediately. "What happened?" he asked softly, though the steel beneath his voice was unmistakable. Emily led him outside to the crushed trolley. One look was all it took. Daniel's jaw clenched, a shift so subtle yet so telling. It was the expression of a man who had seen cruelty before, who recognized targeted intimidation, and who refused to allow another innocent life to be dragged through it. Rose joined them slowly, leaning on the doorframe. "Daniel, I'm sorry you have to see this. They were just boys. I don't want trouble. This isn't boys being boys," Daniel replied, standing. His tall, broad frame cast a protective shadow over the two. "This is deliberate, and it won't stop unless someone stops it." Ranger nudged the broken cart with his nose, then looked up at Daniel with a sharp, understanding gaze. The dog knew what this meant even before his handler did. Danger wasn't approaching. It had already arrived. Daniel exhaled slowly, measured. "I didn't want to involve more people, not at first, but Brandon crossed a line." He turned to Rose. "I need to know, have they ever threatened you before? Anyone come around asking questions?" Rose hesitated. "Yesterday, a car slowed down outside. I thought nothing of it, but maybe I was wrong." That was enough. Daniel's instincts went from watchful to tactical. He pulled his phone from his pocket and began contacting people he trusted. One was Adrian Fox, a former Marine turned community investigator known for his calm demeanor, dark beard, and professionalism. Another was Marta Ellis, a middle-aged woman with a stern face and sharp brown eyes who ran the neighborhood outreach center and had seen more injustice than she could stomach. Daniel didn't tell them everything, only that he needed witness statements collected quietly and swiftly. The next hours were spent gathering evidence. Daniel walked the street, asking neighbors if they had seen the boys. Most hesitated at first, intimidated by Brandon's family name, but Ranger's presence seemed to reassure them. A retired bus driver described the group running past his window. A waitress from the diner recognized Kyle's varsity jacket. A homeless man behind the alley recalled seeing the boys laughing as they fled. Daniel recorded every word. By afternoon, he had built a timeline, a list of names, and proof of harassment. But evidence wasn't enough, not against a wealthy family with lawyers on speed dial. Daniel knew that exposing Brandon meant exposing the truth publicly, and men like Brandon's father feared the public more than anything. That evening, Daniel returned to Rose's home with a plan. He sat with the two of them, Emily holding Buddy, Ranger lying alert at her feet. "This ends when we shine a light on it," Daniel said. "Brandon thinks money makes him untouchable. But truth doesn't care how rich he is." Emily looked up at him, eyes wide. "Will you stay with us?" Daniel placed a hand on Ranger's back. "We're not going anywhere." And because Ranger understood the weight behind those words, the dog lowered his head onto Emily's lap, sealing the promise silently. Trouble had knocked on their door, but they were no longer facing it alone. The abandoned warehouse sat at the edge of the industrial district, resting under a low ceiling of fog that softened the sharp outlines of rusted shipping crates and broken fences. Pale moonlight filtered through jagged window panes, painting long silver streaks across the cracked concrete inside. The place felt forgotten, swallowed by time and dust, yet tonight it waited like a silent witness for a confrontation that could change the course of one little family's life forever. Daniel arrived first. His tall, disciplined frame moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent years reading danger in the dark. His brown hair, cut short in a military style, cast subtle shadows across his square jawline, and the thin scar near his right temple, earned during a desert deployment, caught a faint glimmer of light every time he turned his head. Ranger padded beside him, the retired canine's powerful muscles rolling under his sable coat. Despite his intimidating stature, Ranger's eyes remained steady, watchful, controlled. He was a dog shaped by battle, but tonight he stood not as a weapon, only as a guardian. Daniel inspected the space carefully. The warehouse was empty except for old machinery shelves, metal racks collapsed in twisted heaps, and lingering patches of oil stains hardened over the years. He had placed 2 small recording devices earlier, tucked beneath a fallen beam and another behind a rusted barrel. If things went as he expected, he would soon capture everything he needed. Ranger sniffed the air once, alert but calm. Daniel knelt and rested a hand gently on the dog's shoulders. "No aggression unless they start it," he murmured. "We're here to finish this the right way." Minutes later, headlights broke through the fog, slowly creeping across the warehouse's broken walls. A glossy black SUV rolled to a stop outside, and the slamming of doors soon echoed through the still night. Brandon strode in first, his blonde hair slicked back with expensive gel, but fear flickered beneath his attempted bravado. In the dim moonlight, his face looked younger, almost childish, yet twisted by entitlement and simmering rage. Brandon wasn't alone. 2 hired men followed him inside. The first was Ralph Denton, a thick-set man in his late 30s whose shaved head shone beneath the overhead lamp. He wore a heavy leather jacket and steel-toe boots, and a jagged scar ran from his left cheek down to the corner of his mouth. Rumor had it he'd earned that scar in a bar fight gone wrong years prior, a memory that hardened him ever since. Ralph didn't speak much. His entire presence was one of quiet menace. The second, Eddie Cole, was leaner, a man in his early 40s with sunken cheeks and restless eyes that darted between the shadows. Eddie had a wiry build, like someone who had lived too long with adrenaline as a companion. He carried himself with a jittery energy, suggesting a man in constant anticipation of trouble. Brandon stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at Daniel. "This ends tonight. You're going to drop everything, every accusation, every lie, and walk away, or things will get ugly." Daniel didn't move. His voice remained steady, almost calm. "Brandon, you came here to intimidate me, but you walked into the wrong battlefield." Ranger stood silently at Daniel's side, chest rising slowly, eyes focused. Brandon's face contorted with anger. "You think you're a hero because you saved some trash girl in her mutt?" He gestured sharply at Ralph. "Teach him a lesson." Ralph lunged first. Daniel reacted in an instant, stepping aside with the precise footwork of a trained combatant. Ralph's momentum carried him forward, and Daniel caught his arm, twisting with controlled force before pushing him hard onto the concrete floor. Ralph grunted, but did not rise. Eddie tried next, pulling a short metal pipe from beneath his jacket. Ranger moved before Daniel even signaled, launching forward with a deep, warning growl. He didn't bite. Instead, the dog slammed against Eddie's arm with calculated accuracy, forcing him to drop the pipe as he stumbled back. Ranger stood over him, baring teeth just enough to freeze the man in fear. Brandon, now pale, reached into his jacket, but Daniel stepped closer, his voice low and cutting. "Don't do it. Every second of this is being recorded." Brandon froze. The arrogance drained from his posture as Daniel revealed a small blinking light hidden on the ledge above. "You walked in here threatening violence. You brought hired men. You tried to silence a child. You've given me everything." At that same moment, blue and white lights flooded through the broken windows. Sirens shattered the silence as real officers, those Daniel trusted, stormed the warehouse. Leading them was Officer Grant Holloway, a tall, middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, a full mustache, and a reputation for fairness. His eyes, deep-set and lined from decades of service, scanned the scene with practiced sharpness. "Hands where we can see them," Holloway barked. Brandon's last shred of pride crumbled. He lifted trembling hands as Ranger backed away on Daniel's signal. Officers moved swiftly, cuffing Brandon, restraining Ralph and Eddie, reading each of them their rights. It was over. 3 months later, life looked entirely different. Emily, Buddy, and Rose moved into a modest but warm little house with freshly painted walls and a garden rectangle big enough for wildflower seeds Emily had been saving. Buddy, healthier and stronger, followed Emily everywhere, tail wagging like a tiny banner of triumph. Daniel leased a small storefront on the edge of town. He renovated it himself. New flooring, fresh walls, a sturdy counter, and painted the sign with his own hands, Ranger and Buddy's Corner. The rescue center welcomed abandoned or injured animals. Ranger stood like a gentle sentinel at the door each morning, while Buddy, still a clumsy young pup, learned the daily routines with eager excitement. Emily became the heart of the place. Her bright laughter filled every corner. She brushed the rescue animals, fed them treats, and spent hours teaching them not to fear hands reaching toward them. And sometimes, when Daniel looked at her running across the shop with Buddy racing after her, he felt something inside him finally settle. A soldier's life had carved many scars into him, but now, standing on this new ground, he felt he had found his true mission. A mission built not on war, but on healing. A mission built on family. In a world that often feels too loud, too cruel, and far too quick to forget the small and the powerless, stories like Emily's remind us of something sacred, that miracles don't always arrive with thunder or angels. Sometimes they come quietly, through the steady hands of a soldier, the courage of a child, or the loyalty of a dog who refuses to leave your side. And maybe, just maybe, these moments aren't coincidences at all. Maybe they are the gentle fingerprints of God, nudging the right hearts into the right places at the right time. As you go back to your own life, your home, your routines, your struggles, I hope this story reminds you that goodness still walks among us, sometimes in boots, sometimes on four paws, and sometimes in the small, trembling arms of a child who chooses love instead of fear. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what moment in the story moved you the most. And if you believe that God still works miracles through ordinary people, hit subscribe so you won't miss the stories that restore faith and lift the spirit. May God bless you, protect your family, and place His shield around your home, just as He placed Daniel, Ranger, and little Buddy in Emily's path. If you believe in His protection, His timing, and His quiet miracles, type Amen to claim this blessing.